So this chapter is on culture, media, and communication. I've supplemented the lectures with some videos on both Blackboard and Facebook, and you have the test questions. So if you don't have the test questions with you, I'd get them now, pause the PowerPoint, and then come back. This is a lot of material compressed into just a few slides. So anyway, the big questions are, what is culture? How does culture shape our collective identity? How do our cultural practices relate to class and status? And who produces culture and why? The last one was the relationship between media and democracy. So I put some videos to watch, and one that's on symbols, values, and norms, cultures, subcultures, and how we got here. So if you'd like, you can pause here and come back in a few minutes after you've watched these. They're not that long. So what is culture? Well, culture is different things to different people. It's the norms, values, and material culture that every group of people has. One of the things that changed our meanings of culture was world travel. There was a day and time when people didn't hop on a plane and jet across around the world in a day, where trips took literally decades, and sometimes in planning, but months and months to get from here to where you wanted to go. And that all changed. By the end of the 19th century, anthropologists, which was an up and rising field, viewed the differences between groups of people as learned and biological. Remember, anthropologists are different social scientists that work within a culture, sometimes immersing themselves within the culture. And of course, by the 20th century, culture was defined in entirely different ways of life for people. Today, culture is the system and culture is the practice. So culture as a system refers to the collective rituals that we display in our cultural events, such as in modern Indonesia, cockfighting, which isn't done here. But in the United States, there's different symbols of U.S. culture, including sporting events, the American flag, consumerism, having a Mercedes-Benz, the Super Bowl, etc. How is it practiced? Well, Pierre Bourdieu said that people develop certain set of assumptions about the world and their place in it, and we stay within our cultural groups. Remember, he was the person that talked about habitus, and the kind of habits depend on our upbringing. So, for example, the way that you parent your children will typically be the way that you were parented as a child, or the types of things that you buy, the places you shop or vacation at, become part of your cultural practice. In a way, future choices and opinions are guided by our past experience. So you can take the boy out of the city, but you may not be able to take the city out of the boy. In what ways is culture a form of communication? Well, it is through the transference of language. Language is one of those cultural universals and cultural traits that's common to all humans. There are 1,000 or more different languages around the world, and on average, one estimate I saw was 60 languages around the world are lost every year. Language, in a sense, is the fundamental building blocks of thought. So think about even 400 or 500 years ago, without people being able to read and communicate through written language, what was their thought like? So one of the greatest inventions in modern man is the printing press, allowing people to expand the way they think through language. Providers of many cultural symbols and practices. So language, while it may be different in different cultures, it says something about the cultural symbols and the way people practice around the world. Thinking today about how language is used with emojis and shorthand forms of linguistic practice. So language influences culture but does not completely determine it. Examples include Facebook, the explosion of Facebook. This chart only goes to 2011, but I saw one estimate that there are somewhere around 400 million people around the globe that use Facebook on a daily basis. This chart says 800. It may be higher than that even. So the internet creates new sets of communication possibilities. So instead of everything being verbal, it can be nonverbal as well. It can be used to cover long distances. So family and friends that don't live close, Facebook allows the opportunity for some type of connection with them, including social networks, which everyone is involved in nowadays. Not just Facebook, but Twitter, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, and others. Instant messaging, although that's still around, isn't used nearly as much as some other media like Twitter. But do you think that mass communication, the internet-based communication, has changed the way we have our types of relationships with people? While it expands our possibilities and connections, does it really make people closer? Have there been problems with mass communication? How does culture shape our collective identity? Well, and what distinguishes subcultures from mainstream culture? Mainstream culture, of course, is what we might think of as the normative culture. In America, it would be the what most people typically practice. Subcultures, of course, are minorities within that culture. Subculture might be, for example, Amish people living in Indiana. While they live within the mainstream culture of capitalism in the United States, they practice very different types of lifestyle. And then, of course, there are countercultures who maybe work against the grain, so to speak, of mainstream culture. And they talked about these in some of the videos. Countercultures might be people living in the wilderness, people living on like the Branch Davidians back in the 1980s, or Heaven's Gate that separated themselves off from mainstream culture. Hegemony is the belief that one's form of culture is better than another. It's very intimately related to ethnocentrism. I never quite thought of punks as counterculture, but they're distinguished by their appearance, their behavior, and that sets them apart from mainstream culture. Can you think of any other examples of contemporary resistance through rituals? So you may have heard of the expression of culture wars. So culture wars might pit people that are conservative on one side, the right side of the spectrum, against people that are liberal on the left side of the spectrum. In fact, it's been described as a culture war. And it definitely is occurring in not only in the United States, but all over Europe and other parts of the world. So culture wars are the arguments over proper role of family and religious value in state policy. For example, abortion rights, immigrant rights, and gay rights. Multiculturalism is the belief or policy promoting equal accommodations of different ethnic or cultural groups within the society. So being pluralistic, accepting other people as different, but not judging them in a way that promotes homogeny or heterogeny or hegemony. There have been some metaphors that have been used in the past, including the melting pot, which means I mean, imagine taking a box of crayons and heating them up all together. That's what a melting pot would be. It's losing, in a sense, type your own cultural identity. Um, this is an example of ethnocentrism, that maybe there's one culture that's better than all of them. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, provides alternatives to the melting pot. It evaluates cultural meanings and practices in their own social context. And of course, because of world travel, the globe has become smaller. Um, and it produces and reproduces global and national cultures. So global cultures include the effects, let's say, of the United States on other, maybe even third world countries. When we were in Uganda a few years ago, it was interesting to see Africans who don't speak any English wearing New York Yankees caps. It was as if they became part of, in a small way, the Western culture. So global cultures can best be conceptualized not as a single thing, but as a set of flows, ideas, people, commodities circulating smoothly, and others do not. National cultures are characterized by nationalism. Um, so the Trump movement of MAGA, Make America Great Again, is in a sense a form of nationalism. Nations, in and of themselves, are like imagined communities. Sometimes they're denoted by boundaries, but more by a cognitive set. And of course, they include many social, political, and economic institutions. Um, Nationalism, on the surface, looks like a good idea, but it can have some rather negative implications. The Nazi Party in Germany was an example of nationalism gone wrong. And the systematic effects found in life choices, attitudes, and worldviews are affected by nationalism. We develop these things in early childhood. Uh, Many cultural assumptions are formed early in the early years, including your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, even your cultural beliefs. Preschool reflects national culture and reproduces it. So, for example, saying the Pledge of Allegiance in grade school is a way of reflecting national culture and reproducing it. And preschools in one country may be very different than preschools in another country. Again, the whole point is to reflect and reproduce national culture. Question 3, how do our cultural practices relate to class? Well, depending on what kind of social capital you have, you will practice in different ways. So, for example, elite cultural omnivores practice differently than most of the rest of us do. So, Bordeaux described cultural capital as including our education, our attitudes, and our networks. And for most people, it involves scarcity. On the other hand, cultural omnivores demonstrated by high status consume as much and as often as they want. So if you're wealthy, you have more cultural capital than other people do. If you're poor, you have very little cultural capital. Symbolic boundaries include things like the type of taste that you have, where you eat at, your socioeconomic status, the type of morality you practice, even the type of church that you go to. Roman Catholic churches are often attended by middle class people. Upper class people attend things like Presbyterian and Anglican churches, and lower class people often attend churches like Baptist churches. or other Protestant denominations. And even where you live is affected by, in some ways, by symbolic boundaries. So living in a poor neighborhood reflects your social capital, and living in a wealthy neighborhood, a gated community, reflects something about you as well. Most classes, that is based on your socioeconomic status, are well aware of what class they belong in. Most individuals are. And it's not about money, but it's about the things that you do. Short-term class reproduction occurs in our everyday interactions, confirming our relative statuses. It might be all captured in the expression birds of a feather flock together. Even long-term class reproduction is maintained, especially through the type of wealth that people accumulate. There are advantages associated with wealth obviously, which include all of the things we just mentioned about where you live at, what kind of car you drive, where you eat at, and even the child rearing patterns that you practice. Question 4, who produces culture? Well, obviously we all do. And it's reproduced through media, through our educational systems, through religion, and through government. And the reason that we reproduce culture is to make life predictable, to provide for our own human needs through the establishment of institutions, and to allow the culture to exist and perpetuate itself. And this framing helps us determine how we think about situations. It's what Noam Chomsky, a famous psycholinguist at MIT, calls a propaganda model. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the motto was, if it bleeds, it leads. And so you would think that there were more awful things happening in the world only because the media framed it that way. And you can even see that today. If you watch Fox News, you tend to have things framed in a conservative perspective. If you watch MSNBC or CNN, it's more left-winged. And anything that you watch or listen to on the radio or online has a certain framing to it. The online media has had a profound effect on the world today. More people get their news and knowing what's going on in the world from internet than from print sources. It's good news and bad news. Obviously, the internet is less responsive to local communities. It doesn't report on what happened at your local school board meeting or at city hall meeting, but it does tell you things that happen on more of a global scale. It leads to things like internet activism. An example of that would be the Arab Spring, when massive changes happened in the Middle East, which was all propagated by Facebook and Twitter. So things like during national emergency or local community emergencies, people can develop things like GoFundMe pages that allow not only for national activism but even local activism.